July 12, 1943, Prokhorovka, Kursk salient. The earth shakes as 16 Ilyushin IL-2 Sturmoviks roar overhead at 300 feet. Below them, a column of German Panzer IVs and Tigers scrambles for cover. Too late. The lead IL-2 drops its nose. 8 RS-82 rockets streak from under its wings, trailing white smoke. The first Tiger erupts in flames, then the second, then the third. The Germans have a name for this aircraft, Schwarzer Tod, Black Death. The Soviets call it something simpler, Letayushchiy Tank, the flying tank. And by the time this war ends, it will have destroyed more German vehicles than any weapon in history. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, smashed into the Soviet Union with overwhelming force. 3 million German troops, 3,000 tanks, 2,000 aircraft. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg doctrine had already conquered Poland in weeks and France in 6. Now Hitler had turned that mechanized fury eastward, and the Red Army was collapsing. Within days, entire Soviet armies ceased to exist. German panzer divisions advanced 60 miles in 24 hours. Luftwaffe Stukas ruled the skies, obliterating Soviet defensive positions with terrifying precision. The Soviet Air Force lost over 2,000 aircraft in the first week, most destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. The numbers were catastrophic. By September, the Germans had captured 3 million Soviet soldiers. By October, they were within sight of Moscow's outskirts. The entire Soviet state teetered on the edge of annihilation. Stalin needed a miracle. More specifically, he needed a way to stop the endless tide of German armor that was grinding his armies into dust. The problem was brutally simple. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies, and Soviet ground forces had no effective way to destroy German tanks from the air. The fighters they had were designed for air-to-air combat. Their bombers were too vulnerable and imprecise. And the Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes they'd been using for ground attack were basically flying death traps, slow, unarmored, helpless against modern fighters. What the Red Army desperately needed was an aircraft that could fly low, survive intense anti-aircraft fire, deliver devastating firepower against tanks and vehicles, and do it again and again, mission after mission. They needed an aircraft that could turn the tide. Unknown to the Wehrmacht commanders watching their tanks roll across Soviet soil, that aircraft already existed. Not in great numbers yet. Production had barely begun when the invasion started. But in the design bureaus and factories being frantically evacuated eastward, away from the German advance, engineers were already ramping up production of a weapon that would become Germany's nightmare. Its designation was IL-2. Its nickname would become legendary, and over the next 4 years, more of these aircraft would be built than any combat aircraft in history. But here's where it gets interesting, because the story of how this flying tank came to exist started years before the first German soldier crossed the Soviet border. To understand the IL-2 Sturmovik, we need to go back to 1938, 3 years before Operation Barbarossa, when Soviet military planners were already anticipating the next Great War. The Spanish Civil War had just provided a brutal preview of modern mechanized warfare. Soviet observers watched German and Italian aircraft supporting nationalist ground forces with devastating effectiveness. The lesson was clear. Future wars would be won or lost based on close air support, the ability to destroy enemy armor, artillery, and infantry from the air. The Soviet Union had a problem. Their existing aircraft weren't designed for this role. Fighters like the I-16 were fast and maneuverable, excellent for dogfighting, but lacked the armor and firepower to survive low-altitude attacks against heavily defended ground targets. A single rifle-caliber bullet through the engine or fuel tank could bring them down. They weren't built to absorb punishment. Bombers like the SB-2 could carry heavier weapons, but they operated at medium to high altitude. Dropping bombs from 10,000 feet against moving tanks was essentially guesswork. Hit rates were abysmal, and when forced to fly low for accuracy, they became easy prey for anti-aircraft guns. What Soviet military doctrine demanded was something entirely new, a specialized ground attack aircraft, or SH Sturmovik in Russian, literally, attack aircraft. It needed to fly low and slow enough to accurately hit targets. It needed heavy armor to survive ground fire. It needed powerful weapons to destroy tanks and fortifications. and it needed to be simple enough to mass-produce and maintain under wartime conditions. The stakes were enormous. Soviet military planners understood that the next war would likely be fought on Soviet soil. German rearmament was accelerating. The Wehrmacht was building panzer divisions specifically designed for rapid breakthrough operations. If war came, Soviet forces would face waves of German armor supported by Luftwaffe dive bombers. Without an effective counter, the Soviet Union could lose the war in a matter of months. The requirements seemed almost contradictory. Heavy armor meant weight. Weight meant reduced speed and maneuverability, but ground attack aircraft needed to be agile enough to evade fighters while remaining stable enough for accurate weapons delivery. The engineering challenges were immense. Several design bureaus submitted proposals. Most were conventional, modified fighters or light bombers with incremental improvements. Nothing revolutionary. Nothing that would fundamentally change the battlefield calculus. But the solution would come from an unexpected place. A designer who understood that surviving the ground war required thinking about aircraft design in a completely different way. Enter Sergey Vladimirovich Ilyushin, a self-taught engineer who had risen from peasant origins to become one of the Soviet Union's leading aircraft designers. Ilyushin understood something fundamental that other designers had missed. Armor couldn't be an afterthought. It couldn't be plates bolted onto an existing airframe. For a ground attack aircraft to truly survive, the armor had to be the structure. His concept was radical. Instead of building a conventional aircraft and adding protection, Ilyushin proposed building an armored shell, essentially a flying bathtub, and designing the aircraft around it. The pilot, engine, cooling systems, and fuel tanks would sit inside a single armored capsule made of hardened steel plates ranging from 4 to 12 thick. The design philosophy was revolutionary. The armored shell wasn't just protection, it was load-bearing structure. It would handle stress loads that the fuselage normally carried, eliminating the weight penalty of traditional add-on armor. The result would be an aircraft that was both heavily protected and relatively lightweight for its armor coverage. Ilyushin's team began work in 1938 under the designation BSH-2, Bronirovanny SH Sturmovik, armored attack aircraft. The initial concept featured a two-seat configuration with a rear gunner, low-mounted wings for stability during ground attack runs, and provisions for bombs, rockets, and cannon armament. The challenges were immediate and severe. Wind tunnel testing revealed that the armored nose created unexpected aerodynamic problems. Airflow separation caused buffeting and reduced control effectiveness. The team had to reshape the armor contours repeatedly, balancing protection with aerodynamics. Weight distribution was another nightmare. The armored capsule concentrated mass in the aircraft's center, affecting balance and control. Engineers spent months calculating optimal placement for fuel tanks, weapons, and equipment to maintain proper center of gravity across different loadout configurations. Engine selection posed yet another problem. The aircraft needed enough power to carry its armor, weapons, and fuel while maintaining acceptable performance. Ilyushin initially selected the Mikulin AM-35 engine, a powerful 1,350 horsepower liquid-cooled V12. But the AM-35 was in high demand for fighters, and production priorities were uncertain. By late 1939, the first prototype, now redesignated TS-KB-55, was ready for ground tests. It looked unlike any aircraft the Soviets had built. The armored nose gave it a blunt, brutal appearance. The canopy sat high, providing excellent visibility for ground attack. The wings were thick and sturdy, designed to mount heavy weapons and absorb battle damage. On October 2, 1939, test pilot Vladimir Kokonaki lifted the TS-KB-55 into the air for its first flight. The aircraft handled surprisingly well despite its weight. Control response was positive. Stability was excellent at low altitude. The armored structure showed no signs of stress. But the rear gunner position created problems. The gunner's compartment couldn't be fully armored without making the aircraft too heavy. This left the rear vulnerable, and test reports indicated that without proper protection, the gunner position was essentially a death sentence. Stalin's military leadership made a controversial decision: remove the rear gunner entirely. Make it a single-seat aircraft, save weight, increase production speed, accept the vulnerability from behind. The TS-KB-55 became the TS-KB-57, a single-seat variant. And in March 1941, just 3 months before Germany would invade, it received its official military designation, IL-2. However, what happened during the first months of production would shock everyone involved. The first production IL-2 rolled off the assembly line at factory number 18 in Voronezh on March 10, 1941. Initial production was painfully slow. The armored capsule required specialized manufacturing techniques that Soviet factories had never attempted at scale. Each armor plate had to be precisely shaped and welded. Quality control was critical. A single weak weld point could compromise the entire protective shell. By June 22, 1941, the day Germany invaded, only 249 IL-2s had been delivered to operational units. Most pilots hadn't completed training on the type. Maintenance crews were still learning its systems. Spare parts were virtually non-existent. Then everything changed. As German forces pushed deeper into Soviet territory, Stalin personally intervened in IL-2 production. In a famous telegram to factory managers, he wrote, "The Red Army needs IL-2s as it needs air and bread. I demand more machines. This is my final warning." The message was clear: produce IL-2s or face consequences. Factories were evacuated eastward, away from the German advance. Entire production lines were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and reassembled in the Urals and beyond. Workers labored around the clock. Women, teenagers, and elderly men replaced skilled laborers who had been sent to the front. Production accelerated dramatically. By December 1941, factories were completing over 1,000 IL-2s per month, despite the chaos of evacuation and reorganization. But combat reports from the front revealed serious problems with the single-seat configuration. Without a rear gunner, IL-2s were devastatingly vulnerable to attacks from behind. German Bf-109 fighters quickly learned the tactic: approach from the rear, close to point-blank range, and fire into the unarmored tail section. Control cables, the elevator, the rudder, all were exposed and fragile. Losses mounted. In some units, IL-2s were being shot down faster than they could be replaced. Pilots called flying the single-seater a suicide mission. The aircraft could survive ground fire, but German fighters were massacring them. By early 1942, the decision to remove the rear gunner looked like a catastrophic mistake. Field commanders demanded the two-seat configuration be restored. Stalin agreed. Engineers scrambled to redesign the rear fuselage to accommodate a gunner position with at least minimal armor protection. The modified version, the IL-2M, began production in October 1942. It added 170 pounds, reduced top speed slightly, but gave pilots a fighting chance against pursuing fighters. But its real test was about to come in actual combat, on a scale that would dwarf everything that had come before. June 27, 1941. 5 days after Operation Barbarossa began, the IL-2 entered combat for the first time near Bobruisk, Belarus. The 4th SH Sturmovik Aviation Regiment launched 6 IL-2s against a German motorized column advancing toward the Berezina River. The pilots were hastily trained. Most had fewer than 10 hours in type. Tactical doctrine was still being written, but the Wehrmacht was advancing and desperate times demanded desperate action. The IL-2s approached at treetop level, flying in a loose line-abreast formation. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from the German column, 20 mm flak guns, machine guns, even rifle fire. Tracers filled the air, but the IL-2s kept coming. At 400 yards, the lead pilot opened fire. His 223 MVA cannons, powerful enough to penetrate light armor, hammered the German trucks and half-tracks. Armor-piercing rounds punched through engine blocks. High-explosive rounds detonated among infantry. Then came the RS-82 rockets, 8 per aircraft, streaking into the packed vehicles with devastating effect. The German column disintegrated, trucks burned, ammunition exploded, infantry scattered into the woods. Of the 6 IL-2s, 5 returned to base. One had taken 17 hits from ground fire, all to non-critical areas the armor had held. The Germans had never seen anything like it. Luftwaffe reports described the IL-2 as virtually immune to ground fire and noted with alarm that standard infantry weapons were ineffective against it. One German commander wrote, "It is difficult to shoot down and very dangerous. Our soldiers feel helpless against it." but early operations revealed critical tactical gaps. The single-seat IL-2s were being ambushed by Bf-109s, without fighter escort, which was rarely available in the chaotic summer of 1941. IL-2 formations suffered horrific losses. Some missions saw 50% casualty rates. Soviet tactics evolved through brutal trial and error. Pilots learned to fly in tight defensive circles after attacking, each aircraft covering the tail of the one ahead. They learned to stay at absolute minimum altitude, 50 feet or less, where German fighters couldn't safely pursue. They learned to attack in mass formations of 12 or more aircraft, saturating defenses with overwhelming firepower. By autumn 1941, IL-2 regiments were becoming more effective despite enormous losses. German situation reports increasingly mentioned enemy ground attack aircraft as a serious threat. The IL-2 was learning to survive. This was just the beginning. What came next would cement its legendary status, because the Eastern Front was about to explode into the largest armored battles in human history. By the summer of 1943, the IL-2 Sturmovik was at the height of its power, and the Eastern Front was about to witness the greatest tank battle in history. The Battle of Kursk, July 5 to August 23, 1943, nearly 6,000 tanks, 2 million men, and thousands of aircraft locked in savage combat over the rolling steppes of central Russia. Germany's Operation Citadel aimed to encircle and destroy Soviet forces in the Kursk salient through massive pincer attacks from north and south. The northern thrust alone involved 900 tanks, including the new Tiger and Panther models, supposedly invincible heavy armor that would smash through Soviet defenses. The Soviets knew the attack was coming. They'd prepared deep defensive lines, minefields, anti-tank positions, and massed their IL-2 regiments in unprecedented concentrations. On the first day of the offensive, over 400 IL-2s were committed to stopping the German advance. At Prokhorovka on July 12, IL-2 formations attacked in waves of 30 to 40 aircraft. They came in low, barely clearing the wheat fields, and hit the German armor with everything. 23 cannon fire that could penetrate the thin-top armor of tanks, PTAB-25 anti-tank bomblets that each IL-2 carried by the hundreds, and RS-132 rockets powerful enough to disable even Tigers. German tank commanders reported chaos. Lieutenant Otto Carius, a Tiger ace, wrote, "The Sturmoviks came in constant waves. When one group finished attacking, another appeared. We couldn't effectively defend against them. Our anti-aircraft guns couldn't track them at such low altitude." The kill ratios were devastating. Individual IL-2s were credited with destroying 4, 5, sometimes 6 tanks in a single mission. One pilot, Senior Lieutenant Anna Yegorova, knocked out 3 Panther tanks in one attack run. Another, Captain Nikolai Klepikov, destroyed 9 vehicles, including 2 Tigers, during a single day of operations. But the price was high. German fighters took a terrible toll. The Luftwaffe deployed entire squadrons specifically to hunt IL-2s. Losses during Kursk reached 30% in some regiments. Yet the Sturmoviks kept coming. Stalin's factories were now producing over 1,200 IL-2s per month, faster than they could be destroyed. The Germans called the IL-2 Betonflugzeug, the concrete aircraft, because attacking it felt like shooting at solid concrete. Soviet crews who flew them had another name, Gorbety, Hunchback, for the distinctive profile of the armored nose. But every legend has its darkest moment, and the IL-2's vulnerabilities were about to be tested to their limits. Despite its success, the IL-2 Sturmovik wasn't invincible, and German forces were learning how to kill it. The armor that made the IL-2 legendary only protected the front section. Everything behind the armored capsule, the rear fuselage, control surfaces, tail assembly, was conventional fabric and aluminum construction. This created a fatal weak point that Luftwaffe pilots exploited ruthlessly. Bf-109 and FW-190 fighters developed specific tactics. Attack from directly behind and below, the dreaded 6 o'clock low position where the IL-2's armor couldn't protect it. Aim for the elevator and rudder control cables. A single burst of 20 cannon fire could sever these cables, leaving the IL-2 uncontrollable. Pilots would struggle frantically with dead controls as their aircraft entered terminal dives. German aces became specialists in IL-2 hunting. Oberleutnant Otto Kittel claimed over 120 Sturmovik kills during his career. He described his technique. "You must be patient. Wait for them to commit to their attack run. They focus entirely on the ground target. That's when they're most vulnerable." The statistics were sobering. The average operational life of an IL-2 was just 11 missions. 11 sorties before it was either shot down or so badly damaged it was written off. For comparison, a Bf-109 averaged over 100 combat sorties before loss. Pilot casualties were even grimmer. In 1942 and early 1943, IL-2 pilots had roughly a 25% chance of surviving to complete their standard operational tour. Many units rotated through complete aircrew replacements every 6 weeks. The single-seat configuration proved catastrophic. Without a rear gunner, IL-2s were defenseless against stern attacks. One regiment lost 18 aircraft in 2 days, all shot down from behind by German fighters. Another unit reported that 70% of their losses came from rear hemisphere attacks. The addition of the rear gunner in late 1942 helped, but created new problems. The gunner's position was cramped, poorly armored, and brutally cold at altitude. The 12.7 Berezin machine gun had limited ammunition and frequently jammed in combat. Worse, many gunners were hastily trained, sometimes with as little as 1 week of instruction before being sent into combat. Rear gunners suffered horrific casualty rates. Some historians estimate that over 10,000 IL-2 rear gunners were killed during the war, more than the entire Luftwaffe bomber crew losses on the Eastern Front. It was considered one of the most dangerous positions in the Soviet military. German flak also took a heavy toll. The IL-2's standard attack profile, low, slow, straight approaches, made it vulnerable to massed anti-aircraft fire. German units began deploying quad-20 Flakvierling guns specifically to counter Sturmovik attacks. These weapons could put out 1,800 rounds per minute, a wall of steel that even IL-2 armor couldn't always defeat. Technical problems plagued the aircraft. Engines overheated. Hydraulic systems failed. The M38 engine required constant maintenance and had a service life of just 150 hours before major overhaul. Yet one mission would prove why this aircraft earned its place in history, because at Kursk, the IL-2 didn't just participate in battle. It changed the outcome. July 7, 1943, the southern sector of the Kursk salient. The German II-SS Panzer Corps, containing the elite Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, had broken through the first Soviet defensive line. Nearly 500 German tanks, including 42 Tigers and 200 Panthers, were advancing toward the village of Prokhorovka. If they broke through here, the entire Soviet defensive position would collapse. The Eastern Front could unravel. Everything depended on stopping this armored spearhead. Soviet command made a desperate decision: throw everything at the German armor, every available IL-2, every regiment within range. Saturate the battlefield with Sturmoviks and destroy the panzers before they could achieve breakthrough. At 5:30 hours on July 7, the first wave lifted off. 72 IL-2s from 3 regiments, flying in tight formations of 8 to 12 aircraft. They carried a new weapon that German tank crews didn't yet know existed: PTAB-25 anti-tank bomblets. Each IL-2 carried 192 of these small shaped charge munitions in 4 bomb cassettes. When released, the cassettes would open at low altitude, scattering the bomblets across a 15-meter wide, 70-meter long impact zone. Each PTAB could penetrate up to 70 of armor, enough to pierce the thin top armor of any German tank. The math was brutal. One IL-2 carrying 192 PTABs could theoretically engage a dozen tanks in a single pass. 72 IL-2s meant over 13,000 anti-tank bomblets would rain down on the German armor concentration. The formation approached from the east at 800 meters altitude, higher than normal to allow the PTABs to scatter properly. German flak erupted immediately. Black bursts of 88 fire filled the sky. Tracer rounds from quad-mounted 20 guns created glowing webs of steel. 3 IL-2s fell from the first wave, then 5 more, but the formation held. At 600 meters, the lead regiment commander gave the order: "Release bomblets." The German tankers below saw the sky darken. Thousands of small objects tumbled from the Soviet aircraft. At first, some thought they were leaflets, then the bomblets began hitting. A Panther tank exploded as a PTAB punched through its engine deck. Another was disabled when bomblets penetrated its turret roof. A Tiger took 3 hits simultaneously, engine compartment, turret, and hull, and began burning fiercely. The crew bilayed out into machine gun fire from the IL-2s now strafing at minimum altitude. The second wave arrived 30 minutes later, then the third, then the fourth. By noon, over 300 IL-2 sorties had been flown against the German armor concentration. The battlefield was a nightmare landscape of burning vehicles, exploding ammunition, and choking black smoke. German radio intercepts recorded the chaos. "We're under continuous air attack. Can't move, taking heavy losses. Request fighter cover immediately." But Luftwaffe fighters were engaged elsewhere, and the IL-2s kept coming. By evening, the IISS Panzer Corps had lost over 400 vehicles, not just tanks, but trucks, half-tracks, fuel tankers, ammunition carriers. The spearhead was blunted. The breakthrough had failed. Soviet after-action reports credited IL-2 Sturmovik strikes with destroying or disabling 270 German tanks during the Battle of Kursk, more than any other weapon system. One German officer wrote simply, "The Schlachflieger ground attack aircraft were unbearable." As the war progressed, the IL-2 would continue to evolve into an even more lethal weapon. By 1944, warfare on the Eastern Front was changing, and the IL-2 evolved to match it. The Luftwaffe, while still dangerous, was hemorrhaging experienced pilots. Fuel shortages limited German fighter operations. Soviet forces had air superiority over most of the front. This allowed IL-2 tactics to become more aggressive and flexible. Engineers introduced the IL-2 M3 variant in late 1943, featuring the most significant upgrade: swept-back wings that improved handling at low speeds and reduced the aircraft's tendency to stall during tight turns. The rear gunner position received better armor protection, 12 mm plates instead of the previous 6, and an improved ammunition supply system that reduced jamming. Weapon systems were continuously refined. The standard 23 mm cannons were supplemented or replaced with 37 mm 37 cannons on some variants, massive weapons that could destroy any German tank from the side or rear. The recoil was so violent that pilots reported the entire aircraft shuddering with each shot, and accuracy suffered beyond 400 meters. New bomb types expanded the IL-2's versatility. The AO-25 fragmentation bombs, each aircraft could carry up to 200 devastated infantry and soft-skinned vehicles. The FAB-100 general-purpose bombs provided heavier punch against fortifications, and the ROFS-132 rocket, larger and more powerful than earlier models, could destroy bunkers and small bridges. During Operation Bagration in summer 1944, the massive Soviet offensive that destroyed Army Group Center, IL-2 regiments operated with unprecedented effectiveness. Over 3,000 Sturmoviks supported the offensive, flying more than 60,000 sorties in the first month alone. Soviet tactics had matured significantly. IL-2s now operated in Koordinirovanii Udari, coordinated strikes, where multiple regiments would hit the same target area in carefully timed waves. The first wave would suppress anti-aircraft positions with rockets and cannon fire. The second wave would deliver anti-tank bombs. The third wave would strafe survivors and secondary targets. Production had reached staggering levels. Factories were completing over 1,200 IL-2s per month by mid-1944. Quality control had improved dramatically from the desperate early war period. New pilots received better training, 50 to 80 hours in type before combat assignment, compared to less than 10 hours in 1941. The IL-2 began operating in new roles. Night harassment missions, small formations attacking German supply lines under cover of darkness. Anti-shipping strikes against German vessels in the Baltic and Black Seas. Even urban combat support during the assault on Berlin, where IL-2s flew dangerous missions at building height level to support advancing Soviet infantry. By early 1945, the IL-2 had been joined by its successor, the IL-10, featuring a more powerful engine, improved armor scheme, and fully enclosed gunner position. But production of the original IL-2 continued through war's end because factories could build them faster and crews preferred the familiar aircraft. The final major IL-2 operations occurred during the Soviet assault on Berlin in April 1945, where Sturmovik regiments flew up to 8 sorties per day, supporting the street-by-street advance. And then came the moment that would define its legacy, the final accounting of what this flying tank had actually accomplished. When the war ended in May 1945, the numbers told a story almost too staggering to comprehend. Total IL-2 production: 36,183 aircraft, more than any other military aircraft ever built, more than the B-24 Liberator, more than the Bf-109, more than any fighter, bomber, or attack aircraft before or since. For context, the Soviets built more IL-2s than the United States built P-51 Mustangs and B-17 Flying Fortresses combined. Soviet records credited IL-2 Sturmovik units with destroying or disabling over 70,000 German vehicles during the war. This included approximately 7,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 5,000 artillery pieces, and tens of thousands of trucks, half-tracks, and other transport vehicles. But the cost was equally staggering. Approximately 11,500 IL-2s were lost in combat, a loss rate of roughly 32% of all aircraft produced. Over 7,000 pilots and 10,000 rear gunners were killed. The IL-2 remained one of the most dangerous aircraft to fly throughout the entire war. Yet it had fundamentally altered the Eastern Front. German commanders consistently cited Soviet ground attack aircraft, primarily the IL-2, as one of their most serious operational challenges. Panzer units learned to dread clear weather because it meant the Sturmoviks would come. After the war, IL-2 production continued briefly for export. Poland received several hundred and operated them until 1949. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria also flew the type. North Korea used IL-2s during the opening phases of the Korean War in 1950, though they proved hopelessly obsolete against jet fighters and were quickly withdrawn. The Soviet Union retired its last operational IL-2s in 1954, replacing them with jet-powered ground attack aircraft. But the design's influence persisted. The Soviet Su-25 Frogfoot, the modern equivalent introduced in 1981, incorporated the same design philosophy: heavy armor protection, low-altitude operations, devastating anti-tank firepower. American designers studying the A-10 Thunderbolt II looked at IL-2 combat data when developing their own armored ground attack aircraft. Today, approximately 12 IL-2s survive worldwide, most in museums. Only one, maintained by the Flying Heritage and Combat Armor Museum in Washington State, remains airworthy, carefully preserved and occasionally flown at airshows where its distinctive rumbling Mikulin engine reminds audiences of the Eastern Front's fury. The IL-2 appears prominently in Soviet and Russian military culture. Monuments featuring the aircraft stand in dozens of Russian cities. It appears on stamps, coins, and war memorials. Veterans organizations continue to honor IL-2 pilots and crews at annual commemorations. Sergey Ilyushin, the aircraft's designer, received the Hero of Socialist Labor Award 3 times and numerous other honors. He continued designing aircraft until his retirement in 1970, but the IL-2 remained his most famous creation, the aircraft that, more than any other, bore his name into history. The flying tank had earned its place in the annals of warfare, not through elegance or technological sophistication, but through brutal effectiveness and mass production on a scale the world had never seen. Looking back, the IL-2 Sturmovik was more than just a machine. It was the embodiment of Soviet industrial determination and tactical doctrine in World War II. The aircraft's impact on the Eastern Front cannot be overstated. It provided the Red Army with a capability they desperately needed: the ability to destroy German armor from the air despite overwhelming Luftwaffe opposition in the early war years. While German tanks could outmatch Soviet armor in one-on-one engagements, they had no defense against massed IL-2 attacks from above. Technologically, the IL-2 introduced innovations that influenced military aviation for decades. The concept of integral armor, where protective plating serves as load-bearing structure rather than added weight, became standard in future ground attack aircraft design. The A-10 Thunderbolt II's titanium bathtub protecting its pilot directly descends from Ilyushin's armored capsule concept. The IL-2 proved that specialized ground attack aircraft could be effective despite operating in the most dangerous combat environment. Low altitude, within range of every weapon the enemy possessed. It demonstrated that with proper armor and tactics, such aircraft could survive and deliver devastating firepower mission after mission. Its production numbers set records that will likely never be broken. Building 36,183 of any aircraft represents an industrial achievement of staggering proportions. Particularly when factories were being evacuated, workers were inexperienced, and materials were scarce. The IL-2 production program showed what total industrial mobilization could accomplish. The human cost, however, remained sobering. Over 17,000 pilots and gunners died flying IL-2s, more casualties than entire Allied bomber commands suffered. Yet the aircraft achieved its purpose. It helped stop the Wehrmacht's advance, contributed to every major Soviet offensive from Stalingrad to Berlin, and demoralized German ground forces who learned to fear its appearance. German soldiers who survived the Eastern Front consistently mentioned the IL-2 in their accounts. The sound of its engine became synonymous with danger. Its silhouette meant death for tank crews, truck convoys, and infantry positions. The nickname Schwarzer Tod, Black Death, wasn't propaganda, it was genuine fear. In the final analysis, the IL-2 succeeded because it matched Soviet military requirements perfectly, simple to build, devastating in effect, and producible in massive quantities. It wasn't the fastest, prettiest, or most sophisticated aircraft of World War II, but it was exactly what the Eastern Front demanded, a flying tank that could be built faster than it could be destroyed. And in that brutal arithmetic of industrial warfare, the IL-2 Sturmovik proved unstoppable. So there you have it, the complete story of the IL-2 Sturmovik, the flying tank that became the most produced military aircraft in history. From Sergey Ilyushin's revolutionary armored design concept to the battlefield dominance that terrorized German armor across the Eastern Front, this aircraft proved that sometimes the best weapon isn't the most advanced. It's the one that can be built in overwhelming numbers and deliver devastating results mission after mission. 36,183 aircraft were built, flying over 1.6 million combat sorties and destroying an estimated 70,000 German vehicles. It remains the most produced combat aircraft ever built, a record that stands to this day, nearly 80 years later. The IL-2 transformed ground attack aviation, influenced every subsequent dedicated attack aircraft from the A-10 Thunderbolt II to the Su-25 Frogfoot, and proved that integral armor design could create survivable aircraft for the most dangerous combat environment imaginable. What impressed you most about this legendary warbird? The revolutionary armored design, the staggering production numbers, or the brutal effectiveness that earned it the name Black Death? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more deep dives into WW2's most influential aircraft, from the fighters that ruled the skies to the bombers that changed warfare, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching WW2 Aviation, and I'll see you in the next one.